right. We are live this morning. Thanks to all of you who come out. Thanks to you who view the streams. We are in the book of Isaiah in chapter 47, and the subject this morning is I will take vengeance. If you know anything about the nation of Babylon, especially ancient Babylon, there may be a few things that would be of note. One of those things is that one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world was in Babylon. It was called the Hanging Gardens, and it was a beautiful garden that was in Babylon. Of course, there have been some historians that question the validity of it, but they had one of the ancient wonders of the world. Babylon was also, at one point, the strongest nation in the world. They had several strong rulers, but most notably was a man by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is not just a long name and one that's hard to spell. It was one of the many rulers of Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar was one that had a large army, and the Bible says that God raised up for judgment among the nations. And Babylon became a very wealthy and powerful nation, to the point where, really, if you wanted anything, you went to Babylon for a brief time in history. And Isaiah in chapter 47 is pronouncing judgment upon Babylon. But the one thing that we always have to remember when we're studying the book of Isaiah is that Babylon is not a really strong nation at the time that Isaiah is writing this. They are beginning to become powerful. They have fought different places. But in reality, Babylon is not near what they would become. And yet Isaiah, by the vision of God, by the Spirit of God, begins to see that Babylon is going to become a very powerful nation, and then that God is going to bring judgment upon this great nation. Let's look at Isaiah chapter 47 and verse 1. It's an interesting start to the chapter. It says, "Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground, there is no throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt no more be called tender and delicate." Here is an interesting situation here. Babylon, for many, many years, at the time that this judgment will come, which is well about 200 years into the future. But at the time that it would come, Babylon was a very powerful nation. So as a lot of people have compared America to Babylon, and there's reason for that. Babylon was a land of pleasure. They were a land of power. They pretty much had control over most of the world at the time. Their influence went way beyond Babylon, and they really were living a life of ease. We know that because most of the world was okay with Babylon's rule when they were in power. You'll probably recall the story of the 3 Hebrew children in the fiery furnace. And that story comes about because of King Nebuchadnezzar. Because King Nebuchadnezzar would go and build a very large statue of himself, an image that was 90 feet tall, to show his great power, and told all the people that they should bow down to it. This was more than just trying to receive a little bit of glory. This was also to establish and put in the minds of all the kingdoms that Nebuchadnezzar was the one that had the power. You see, to bow down to a king signified that he was in power and he was in control. And Nebuchadnezzar wanted the world to know that he was the leader, and so he had all the different countries and all the different nations and their rulers bow down. Except we find that obviously the 3 Hebrew children did not. And so we have a power struggle that happens, and the 3 Hebrew children are thrown in the fiery furnace, and God's with them and delivers them. But Babylon was a very powerful nation. And And they did pretty much whatever it is they wanted to do. But there came a time when their rejection of God led to their downfall. And I would say very, very clearly, I think we are seeing a strong division that is happening in America this morning. As obviously there is an election in November. All right, I know that everybody loves politics. Of course, if you know me, you know I don't really like to talk about politics that much. But I do think that the political situation that we're in right now shows the situation that America is in. Because we have virtually two parties that have very interesting things going on. We have the one party, of course, being the Republican nominee that was nearly assassinated a couple weeks ago, and signs if it wasn't for a fortuitous turn of the head would have been. And then we have another one where the party's not even sure that they're going to keep their current candidate. They're trying to maybe get him to step down, maybe replace him with someone else. There are cognitive questions. And so here it is. This is the situation that we have. A massive division among a country. Really wasn't very long ago at all that in 2020 there was actually I guess it was 2021, there was a massive riot that would take place at the capital of the United States of America, which seemed to take people by surprise, but there's massive division. We look at it and there are very real problems that are facing America today that maybe many aren't thinking about. There's, of course, the problem of Social Security, and thankfully there are many elderly people and some that are even younger that are taking part of the Social Security thing, and we thank the Lord for that, and thankful that it sustained people, but it's a very real problem. Social Security is set to run out, I think, in 2035, to a point where it will have to be reduced. They said at least 75%. There are real problems that are faced. There are a lot of people that are on Medicare and Medicaid, and those can be very good helps, but I believe that Medicare also is set to run out in 2035. So there are very real problems that are going on, and yet we serve the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who has power over all of these things. And so I would look at it this morning and look at the situation that happens when you leave out God. Look at verse number 2. It says this: take the millstones and grind meal. Now, we have to stop for a moment. A millstone is a very, very large stone. Generally one that you would almost never use to grind meal. Because when you think about grinding meal, you're trying to grind out all of the bad stuff, and nowadays machines do the processing for us. We don't have to do it by hand anymore. But during the Babylonian times, the ancient time when this is written, they would have to grind out the meal. They would use stones, and they would kind of press them down and push out the good stuff, and they would use it. You would definitely not use an extremely heavy stone to do it, because it would be completely useless. For one, it would pound out everything, not just the stuff that you were trying to save. It would just crush it all. And number two, it would make the job much more difficult than it needed to be. It says, take the millstones and grind meal. Uncover thy locks, make bare the leg, uncover the thighs, pass over the river. Thy nakedness shall be uncovered. Now, there was an amazing thing that happened both in Babylon and in Israel. And that is, as they became prosperous, they also began to live very sensual lifestyles. There began to be more of a life of ease. And so we find, especially when you look in the prophets, in Jeremiah especially, you'll see that there is a very serious issue going on in Israel. Many of the people of Israel were running around and literally sleeping around with the Babylonians and the Assyrians and whoever else. They were living a very promiscuous lifestyle. And the same thing was going on in Babylon. Babylon was actually known for its promiscuity. They had really there was no real teaching of right and wrong in Babylon. Every man did what was right in his own eyes, and there was power and there was affluence. They were rich and wealthy, and there really wasn't anyone to say you shouldn't do something. And so they were living their life of ease, but God told them, as you've lived your sensual lifestyle and your promiscuity, you're going to find that God is going to send judgment that will cause those things to happen in your life to your shame. God says in verse 3, I will take vengeance, and I will not meet thee as a man. One of the main problems with sin, trying to redirect here, to make a spiritual application here. One of the main problems with sin is that sin isn't really against man. Now, you can talk about a sin against a man. Of course, we would say something that is done that is sinful, that basically harms another person. We might call it a sin against a man. Such as if someone were to steal something from someone, or someone were to kill someone, or something like this, or do something that we know to be wrong. But in reality, there are a lot of things about sin that have nothing to do with man, but with God. You see, there are 10 commandments that God wrote on stone and gave to Moses. Now, if I were to ask each one of you to name the 10 commandments, I would find it interesting to see whether or not we could get them all. I would doubt that we would, because most people, while they know there are 10 commandments, do not know what they are. But the first one is quite simple, and they're summarized because they're actually quite longer in Scripture, Exodus chapter 20. Number 1 is very simple. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And this one is almost violated on a daily basis by the grand majority of Americans, because we have everything and anything before God. Most people would much rather do almost anything on Sundays than follow the things of God. They're very interested in the sporting events that are going on. They're interested in the different events all over the place, maybe concerts and programs that happen on Sunday. Sunday has become one of the most commercial days in America, and at one time almost everything was closed on Sundays. It's amazing the change when you leave out God. It is interesting that during the New York City prayer meetings, you may have heard of these, it was a long time ago actually, it was in the 1800s, but during the New York City prayer meetings, the amount of crime went down drastically in the city of New York, because there was a turning to God. But I will tell you now, it's one that New York City and Los Angeles as well have some of the largest police forces in the world because of one problem. They have massive crime. I'm not saying anything against either one of those cities. Obviously, they're trying to protect their citizens, but there is massive crime. I remember my dad was pastoring in Rising Sun, and he met with the police chief of Rising Sun, and my dad was talking about different things. They were talking about different things around the community, and the police chief told my dad, he said, the best thing you can do is to have your church to grow, because it's the only combat that we really have against crime. Because the crime in Rising Sun was through the roof, because there were casinos that were not far away, and ever since they had went in, the crime had been very, very high, to the point where it was nearly uncontrollable. You see, you leave out God, and you think it's okay. But I want to tell you some things that happen when you leave out God, because it's very clear, just looking at the nation of Babylon, we can get some real clear pictures. When you leave out God, there are a few things that happen. One is that there is an abuse of power. There is abuse of power. This is very, very clear in Babylon. You have Nebuchadnezzar, who goes and has power and creates an image and causes people to bow down. If you didn't bow down, you were thrown in the fiery furnace. There was an abuse of power to the point where God is involved in Nebuchadnezzar's life, and there's a time where Nebuchadnezzar suffers from serious mental issues to the point where he's actually not ruler for a brief period of time, as God reminds him that he's in charge. But when God is not in the picture, there's abuse of power. We see that very evidently in America. There's all kinds of power struggles going on between parties sometimes, between authorities. There's all kinds of things going on right now. So much so that most people do not believe they can trust their politicians, and quite honestly, if there was one they could, they would be surprised, because it has become very, very noteworthy and known that politicians practically lie in almost every one of their speeches and almost every one of their events, and it's considered okay, it's campaigning. But there's a serious abuse of power when God is left out. Number two, there is a massive breakdown of family and morality when God is left out. Because in Babylon, there was no reason for there to be a family. Everyone felt like that they had the power to do what they wanted to do. They could do whatever they wanted. And so you had sensuality, which destroys the family. If you want to know something that will destroy the family quicker than almost anything, I will tell you what it is. It's a simple thing. Just have a husband or a wife go out on their spouse, and you'll find that marriages break down very quickly. And so it is very common that right now in America, it's much more common for there not to be marriage at all, as there is so much unfaithfulness that most people don't trust marriage in the first place. And this is what happened in Babylon. There was an increase of promiscuity because God is left out. See, when you leave out God, things happen. When you leave out God, pornography becomes rampant. Why? Because the thing that keeps you from violating and looking upon those kind of things is God. When God is left out, pornography rises. When God is left out, there is abuse of sexual things. I just heard a report the other day that sex trafficking in the United States is at a point where it should be one of the most main concerns because it's so prominent. There are people on a wide scale now that are selling their children into sexual lifestyles. They're literally selling their children as prostitutes, and a lot of your authorities are saying it's one of the biggest problems in the United States right now. There's massive pornography issues, there's massive sex trafficking going on, there is sexual abuse. Almost every single high school student has been involved in some kind of sexual encounter, and a lot of times it's not been a willing one. Why? Because when God is left out, sensuality becomes a major thing. So much so we lose the boundaries that God has set. That is the final thing that we'll bring up this morning. The boundaries that God has set become violated. You know, it's interesting that I've said this before when I was a young child. There was really no question when I was a child that a man was going to be with a woman and vice versa. You know, I remember in kindergarten, you know, some of the boys would try to kiss the girls and different things. There was no question. It wasn't even a thought. Besides, it was the first time that we didn't see anything different than that. When I was in high school, there was an individual that was homosexual, and people were very concerned about it. It was something that was weird and unheard of. But now we see that it's widespread. Of course, that was now a long time ago. That was nearly 30 years. That was now 20 years ago. Now things have changed drastically. Now it's commonplace. It's not only commonplace, it's promoted. And so now we've changed and we've removed the boundaries that God has set. We question whether or not that there should be just two genders, and now there are people coming up with all kinds of things, using plural pronouns and calling themselves non-binary and all kinds of things, when God has made it very clear that he created a male and a female. And yet, we try to remove God's boundaries. And so it happens. The abuse of power, the increase of sensuality, the removal of God's boundaries. So much so now that we've tried to say that God didn't create the world. It's evolution and all of these things. But the issue is this morning that you're not just talking about abstract philosophies. Because there is a real issue, and it's this, that there is a God that takes vengeance. And it's not on man's level. To live a life that is against God, to have a country that lives against God, brings the vengeance of God. You see, if we're just fighting against another man, then it's not so big of an issue. Each one of us, thinks, well, we have powerful armies and powerful tanks and powerful planes and all of these things and powerful ships. And if we're talking on a personal level, people can say, well, I'm stronger than them, or I've got more friends, or I can get through this. If you're just going against a man, then that may well be true. You may have the strongest army. You may have the most support, the most money behind you. But I want to tell you this morning, we're not fighting against God. Against man, it's against God. God says, I will take vengeance. And one of these days, each one of us is going to stand before God, and he's going to look at our life and see how we lived it. Did we live it like the Babylonians did, and as Israel was doing during the time of Isaiah? Did we lie and cheat and take advantage of people? Did we bend the rules that God set in place in sensuality? Was there immorality in our lives? Did we do things that were ungodly? Did we set forth the plan that God put in place? Did we move the boundaries that God had set? You see, any time that we commit an act of sin, it's not against man, it's against God. We have moved the boundary that God has set, and the boundary really doesn't move. We bring God's wrath upon our life. In Psalms chapter 7 and verse 11, it's a very, very powerful verse in the Bible, because it tells us that God judges the righteous, and God is angry with the wicked every day. It was only a matter of time before God sends judgment. And likely, unless God were to come back, there is likely going to be judgment placed upon America. It's only a matter of time before we see the judgment of God. There's only a matter of time in our personal lives before we see the judgment of God. For God judges us for our sin, and we're brought before him, and he says, were you transformed by the blood of Jesus Christ? Was your life changed? Did you forsake sin? Did you trust me? Really, that's the question this morning. What are we going to do about God taking vengeance? Are we going to face his wrath and continue to live a life of sin, or are we going to come to him and say, Lord, I've sinned. I need the mercy of God. I'm outside your will, but I want to be changed. Hallelujah. I pray that we'll choose the way that's godly and right this morning. Thanks to all of you come out. Thanks to you who view the streams. We appreciate your support. Pray that you have a wonderful day in the Lord. Be prayed up, blessed up, and ready to go. Have a wonderful afternoon.